Can you bring
Right.
us back now to the different phases of what this movement is actually demanding? And maybe now it's changing significantly as things continue to accelerate. But in order to do that, could you at least take us back? I know I'm asking a lot, but to 1997 and the origins
Mm.
of one country, two systems, and how that fits into how things are playing out now.
Yeah, everything is absolutely connected in that way from, way back to 1997. So Hong Kong was handed back from British rule to Chinese rule in 1997 under the promise that Hong Kong would be guided by this principle of one country, two systems, and would be able to retain a very high degree of autonomy. It would have freedoms of speech and assembly, which doesn't exist on the mainland. It would have an independent judiciary, and it would mean Hong Kong would have law, which is very much cherished and the bedrock of success for Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong was promised that. And it was also promised to have universal suffrage, which is that everyone, ordinary people, can vote for their leaders. And that was a promise enshrined in the mini constitution called the Basic Law of Hong Kong. So there are all these, democratic promises that were never realized. So fast forward to 2014 when Hong Kong saw, the unprecedented civil disobedience mass movement called the Umbrella Movement, where people occupied major roads in different parts of Hong Kong for 79 days. That was something that no one saw happening, but that was completely spontaneous and sort of grassroots and organized, just, bottom up by the people. And they were calling for the right to elect their own leader, which is selected by a very small group of people and eventually appointed by Beijing. They're saying, the Constitution promised this right to us, let's have it. And that failed. And since then, we have seen a crackdown on dissent and on opposition by the government, both Beijing and the local Hong Kong government. And, in the past 5 years since the Umbrella Movement in 2014, we have seen freedoms being eroded step by step. And we see the courts being politicized to go after effectively dissidents and active pro-democracy activists. So, and the latest movement was sparked originally by this bill, right? This
Mm-hmm.
reviled bill that would have allowed extradition to mainland, which would mean exposing people in Hong Kong familiar and used to rule of law to China's judicial system, which is, a cause for major alarm for all sectors, from business to legal to workers. It's just a large cross section of society who could be caught up in this. So it started with this bill, but we're in the 10 weeks of this protest movement now, and since then it has morphed into a call for democracy again. And with police for the first time using just so much tear gas, and for the first time rubber bullets and sponge rounds and beanbag rounds and all these new weapons, and which they say are used to disperse largely peaceful protesters, but also some more confrontational and violent protesters as well. They a new rallying call has been for, against police brutality and for an independent investigations into these allegations of police violence. And many people think this is a very basic thing to do, that it should not be hard for Hong Kong to set up an independent
Right.
investigation into police behavior, but authorities have completely refused to compromise on that point. So we're seeing a deadlock now, with protests escalating in terms of their level of force and intensity, and police violence also escalating. So it's really, even Carrie Lam, the pro-Beijing leader, who is, the focus of ire
She's
all
the
these
head
weeks and
of
all
Hong
these
Kong,
months.
right? Just to tell people,
Yes,
Carrie Lam. Yep.
yeah, she's the
Hmm.
head of Hong Kong, and she is, you know, now definitely the most unpopular leader in Hong Kong's history since the handover. And she has just refused to compromise on all these protesters' demands. She did agree to suspend the bill, but
Hmm.
protesters are calling for a permanent withdrawal. And people are questioning why she can't just say the word withdraw. She said the word suspend, she said the word dead, but people were still distrustful because they basically see no way they can trust the government that this bill will be permanently gone until they use the word withdraw. So there's a complete breakdown of trust, between two sides, and the government has only adopted a completely hardline approach, which is of course only going to make things worse.
Is there, so it would be in waves, right? Because there was some police response. Then there was the uh, day or two where they unleashed, like they contracted triads gangs to
Mm.
beat protesters. Now there's just been like a real acceleration of police response, and then the next step would be actual direct Chinese intervention.
There are there's definitely talk about Chinese intervention.
Hmm.
Uh, Analysts are saying, the calculus for China for Beijing to send in, to intervene in their own ways, whether that's military or not, they have to make a uh, very, very delicate calculus, and it was quite unthinkable in the past few weeks. But people are saying, when the Chinese Communist Party is under threat, a lot of things are possible. So, the thing about Hong Kong's movement is that you can't really predict what's going to happen anymore. But for the Chinese military to get involved, that would, of course, evoke the bloody crushing of pro-democracy protests in China in 1989 in the Tiananmen Square massacre. And of course, remains one of the darkest chapters of modern Chinese history. And of course, Beijing authorities are aware of that. But
I,
now the stakes, yeah, have just changed. And I still think it will have to take quite a lot for that to happen. But there are analysts I've seen saying maybe nothing can be ruled out at this point.
well, it's also strikes me, and I hate to be pessimistic, but it's like this is also the era where we have, and I don't idolize what came before this. I think obviously, there's plenty of structural problems in, say, like the 1990s order of the world. But if
Mm.
we're in a geopolitics where India can just say, and there already were enormous human rights problems in Kashmir, but an Indian government can just say, no, we're tearing up
Mm.
the Constitution. We're just going to do it. I mean, there is this sort of broader global atmosphere from the United States to India to Brazil and so on. And I'm not
Yes,
saying that China follows those leads, but I mean, there's clearly a pattern here which that would fit in terms of just this sort of like authoritarian acceleration. That's the
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, sorry. Go. I had one more question, but go ahead, please. What are your
Hmm.
thoughts on
No,
that?
I was just going to add,
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of global geopolitics, with the rise of authoritarianism and all the events, unraveling, it, yeah, it could fit into, the broader and extremely alarming trend we're seeing globally. So yeah, just to say, you're right to point that out in a global context.
Do you think that this so I understand that since the handover in 1997 that the Chinese government has not honored the agreement in totality, obviously, but we do have a new well, not at this point, he's not a new Chinese leader, but a Chinese leader now who is definitely has taken things in a bit of a different direction in terms of sort of like Chinese external posture. So, what
Mm.
role does a more sort of like And it's still relative. I mean, I do think it's important in an American audience that, like, yes, China's certainly gotten more assertive in foreign policy, and there's areas that have always been points of contention, whether it's the occupation of Tibet, situation with Hong Kong, situation with Taiwan. And then besides that, I mean, obviously the United States is infinitely more of an interferer across the world. However, we see this sort of new rhetoric, a new approach in some ways, a different stance in Africa, kind of a new great game in Africa. So to what extent do you think that there's also just the specific dynamics of Xi Jinping and what's happening in a Chinese context right now?
Yeah, so President Xi is the most powerful leader since Mao and in decades, and he has really concentrated power around him. And when he basically declared himself president for life by abolishing the term limits for presidents, people are saying in Hong Kong, how can you have two systems, one under one emperor? So basically, that moment has really dashed any hopes of democracy in Hong Kong, but people are still fighting for it. And since you mentioned Tibet and Taiwan as well, of course in Xinjiang, where more than 1 million Muslims have been detained, in these concentration camps.
The Uyghurs, yeah, excuse me.
Exactly. Yeah, and Hong Kongers are looking to that as well. And they're saying that is the dystopian version of this Chinese government. And if Hong Kongers don't fight for it, one day they can become like that as well, subject to extreme surveillance and just completely deprived of the most fundamental human rights. So we're seeing, these happening in the border regions of China, and most notably and most horrifyingly in Xinjiang. So definitely, in the era of Xi Jinping, you sense that, heightened level of authoritarianism, and it really shapes the urgency of this current movement as a result.
Elaine Yu, I really appreciate your time. I hope you'll keep us posted. And I know it's extremely late, maybe extremely early in Hong Kong. But please keep us posted. We'll continue to follow this. I really appreciate your time.
No, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you. Elaine Yu, she's a reporter for the AFP. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.